Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí y tengo ganas de nuestras conversaciones. No puedo dar una conferencia en español todavía, entonces voy a hablar en inglés, pero antes quiero agradecer al Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Género y al Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas de UNAM, al Instituto Nacional de las Mujeres y a ONU Mujeres por haber hecho posible mi visita. Gracias. Y entonces en inglés. So I think my starting point is that in the course of the last decade, the language of gender equality has become firmly embedded in national and international documents. So UN Women, founded in 2010 as the United Nations organization dedicated to gender equality and the empowerment of women, and on its website it elaborates its mission as, quote, creating an environment in which every woman and girl can exercise her human rights and live up to her full potential. The Council of Europe, which is a key international human rights body founded in 1949, which did not even include gender in its original prohibited grounds of discrimination, now describes achieving gender equality as central to its mission, so it's come a long way. And its gender equality strategy aims at, quote, an equal visibility, empowerment, responsibility and participation of both sexes in all spheres of public and private life. It also means an equal access to and distribution of resources between women and men. In Latin America, there is the Gender Equality Observatory, set up by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, which monitors the progress of gender equality in member states. And this defines gender equality as, again to quote, equality in the exercise of power, in decision-making, in mechanisms of social and political participation and representation, in diverse types of family relations, and in social, economic, political, and cultural relations. So I could go on, but I think any of us could collate similar statements from both national and international documents, which demonstrate the crucial importance, on paper at least, that is now accorded to the notion of gender equality. Most of the mission statements are recent, but the impression they give is that no self-respecting government can now afford to ignore the question of gender equality. Now, at the same time, we are witnessing often vicious attacks on the notion of gender. So just to give some examples, in Hungary, the Gender Studies Department of the Central European University has recently closed in the midst of major governmental attacks on the university itself. And in fact, the Hungarian government subsequently banned gender courses in any of its universities. Even using the term gender is said to disrupt the natural order in which women are women and men are men, and is said to undermine the sanctity of the family. And this is not an isolated phenomenon. I think both the Catholic Church and many of the evangelical churches have been targeting the language of gender for many years. Before he was elected Pope, for example, the previous Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger, described the concept of gender as, quote, an insurrection against the limits man carries within him as a biological being. And through the early 2000s, the Vatican produced a number of theological critiques of the notion of gender. In Brazil, in 2015, 8 state-level assemblies voted for the deletion of gender language in their educational policy. And it was also in Brazil in 2017 when Judith Butler was confronted by an angry demonstration at a conference she had co-organized, where her effigy depicting her as a witch was burnt. In the United States, the Trump administration has said that it would like to remove all references to gender in United Nations documents, replacing them by what it sees as the less problematic language of women. So there should be no reference to gender-based violence, for example, but only to violence against women. I mean, hopefully the results of the midterm elections mean that that kind of development doesn't go any further, but who knows. So the point there is that the normalization of the language of gender equality in so many governmental, national and international bodies is being accompanied by major counter-movements that reject the very language of gender. Now, we might see this as just the standard pattern. You know, gender equality becomes more mainstream. There's obviously a backlash against it. This is a kind of common pattern in politics. But I think in this instance, the mainstreaming and the backlash don't map on particularly neatly. For one of the things that strikes me forcefully about this moment is how little the gender theorists who are being attacked in this backlash, how little they employ the language of gender equality, which, as I say, is becoming embedded much more in national and international documents. The key words that it seems to me appear most commonly in books and articles on gender are terms like agency, subjectivity, affect. Equality, it seems to me, languages as a much less interesting term. Now, I used to think, I think this has been true for some time, and I used to think that this was because there was nothing much more to say about gender equality. You know, we know we want it, we know we don't have it, we clearly face major battles in our attempts to achieve it, but perhaps there just aren't any very interesting conceptual challenges in working on it, so gender theorists work on something else. I now think this is mistaken, and that the relative lack of engagement with notions of gender equality in contemporary gender theory speaks to deeper concerns. So I want to talk today about some of these concerns. Some of the reasons why feminists, and I think some of this is more broadly relevant to those just generally on the progressive left, but why feminists seem to have withdrawn relatively from the language of equality. As I hope will become clear, I recognise and I share many of the concerns that I think lie behind this shift, but I do not at all share the view that we should stop talking about gender equality. I think we need to understand equality as a transformative, not arithmetic ideal, but we cannot do without it. So in what follows, I just want to pick out what seem to me three aspects of what I see as a kind of a retreat from or a kind of problematization of the language of equality in some contemporary theory. So the first of these is broadly associated with post-colonial or decolonial critiques, and I'm thinking here of people like Frantz Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, Walter Mignolo, theorists who've highlighted the violence that was visited, the violence that was visited on the colonized and the enslaved in that very period when what we think of as the modern conception of equality was being articulated. So if you take Fanon, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, he excoriated the humanism that pretended, as he saw it, to a belief in the indelible rights of man, and yet practiced a brutal dehumanization on its colonial subject. So he writes, quote, "Of this Europe, where they have never done talking of man with a capital M, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe." And I think this notion becomes a key point in post-colonial theory, the idea that this high-minded discourse about humanity and equality and the rights of man coincided with a violent dehumanization of most of the world's inhabitants. Now, we can, and I think some people do, tell a relatively benign story about this conjunction. We can say, And I think this is what many people say. We can say that, well, when people first started articulating notions of equality that broke with God-given or natural hierarchies, so say roughly from the 16th century onwards, we can say, well, they didn't yet have the imagination to see that all men being equal in a state of nature, which is one of the tropes that emerges in this period. They didn't yet have the imagination to see that all men might eventually mean all women too. Or that given the assumptions of the period, they did not have the capacity to envisage that it might eventually come to mean all men and women, regardless of biology, physiognomy, beliefs, cultural practices, continent, and so on. In this, I think, rather complacent story about the way in which ideas develop, it was entirely understandable that notions of equality would have started out in a very limited way, but the logic of the ideas being articulated from several centuries ago then pressed beyond these limits to eventually deliver rights to all. This is not, in the view of most post-colonial theorists, nor I would say of my own, a very convincing explanation. I think one stumbling block is that if later ideas of equality for all were indeed logically implicit in those early, 16th, 17th century articulations, it took a very long time for that logic to assert itself. And I think an even more important stumbling block is that many people did have the imagination. In fact, as soon as people started talking about the equality of men in a state of nature, it was argued, sometimes in fact as the reason for rejecting this subversive argument, that once you go down that road, you're going to have to accept that women are equal too. So people started saying this right from the beginning, right? And when the French revolutionaries declared the rights of man in 1789, the ink was hardly dry on the declaration before people like Alain de Gouges, the Marquis de Condorcet, Mary Wollstonecraft claimed these rights for women too. And it was only 2 years after the declaration that slaves in Saint-Domingue, later Haiti, took the proclamations, the French proclamations of the rights of man, as incompatible with slavery and embarked on the first large-scale slave revolution. My point there is that the denied and the excluded were in fact very quick to spot that this language of equality could be applied to them, but it was many centuries before the force of such arguments was to be conceded by those in power. So broadly, those writing in the post-colonial or decolonial mode are unimpressed by the happier story about things start in a very limited way and then gradually over the centuries they become extended to us all. And the more typical argument is that the violence and the inequality were part and parcel of the emerging understanding of equality and not an accidental accompaniment. So you can see how this casts a shadow over what the language of equality might actually mean if it's born out of this particular moment. So if you think, as an example of this, of the way notions of the human were being reframed and reinterpreted in this period, Sylvia Wynter, who's a Jamaican writer and cultural theorist, I think provides a compelling illustration in her analysis of the encounters between the Spanish conquistadores and communities of Caribs and so-called Indians in the Caribbean and the Americas in the 16th century, and looking at the justifications that the Spanish gave themselves for their destruction and enslavement of indigenous peoples. And she writes about the very famous dispute in the 1550s between the Dominican priest Bartolomé de las Casas, and who came to devote himself to defending indigenous communities, and Gines de Sepúlveda, who defended the rights of the settlers to subject the Indians to the brutalities and forced labour of the encomienda system. And Wynter argues that if you look at that debate, that very famous debate, which is, in a sense revolved around the question of, do these people have souls? Are they human, right? She argues that Las Casas was still thinking within a very universalistic Christian ethic in which the big difference between people was about the level of spiritual perfection that they were able to arrive at. And from his perspective, if you think that that's the kind of difference between people, then he saw no intrinsic difference between the Spanish and the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas. In fact, considering the brutalities of the invaders, he thought that the indigenous inhabitants had a good claim to be at a higher spiritual state. And he also pointed out that there was no justification for treating people as Christ deniers before they'd even been given the opportunity of embracing Christianity. And this incidentally was, I think, one of the stranger moments of these encounters. You know, there was this brief period, I'm sure this is very familiar to you, but it only became clear to me relatively recently, when the Spanish settlers were required by decree from Spain to justify their enslavement of indigenous peoples by showing that they had refused the word of God. If they refused the word of God, you could do anything, right? Because they really kind of didn't figure as kind of, as worthy of being treated with any kind of dignity or respect. So in this kind of, there was this brief period in which any slave raiding or land grabbing episode had to be preceded by a notary reading out to those about to be enslaved an entirely incomprehensible theological document in Latin, right? And when there was no reaction to this, people didn't immediately sign up to become kind of Christians as a result of this, then it was taken that the subsequent brutality was deemed justified. This approach worked, though entirely dishonestly, within the older religious mode. But the justification soon moved away from that, away from the willingness or otherwise to embrace Christianity, to claims about just how human people were. So this is kind of part of what Winter brings out of that debate, that Sepúlveda notoriously described the peoples of the Americas as homunculi, little people. And when he compared their capacities for reason with those of the Spanish, he saw them as almost, quote, like monkeys to men. Right, so what you hear in this is a kind of a new, very hierarchical conception of natural differences between human beings. And for Winter, this is a key moment in the articulation of the modern conception of the human, which was not then a particularly egalitarian notion, rights for all, we're all human under the skin, but one marked from its origins by racism, hierarchy, and brutality. And in this argument, the classification of humans by reference to their perceived capacity for reason then set in train the self-serving justifications that later served to justify the Atlantic slave trade, the colonization of India, the colonization of Africa. And in this new human norm, white European men were, in Winter's term, overrepresented. And she argues that this continues to legitimate racist institutions and discourse well into our own time. Now, if you think of the history of the notion of equality in that light, right, it gives many people pause for thought. Though, in fact, it's notable that Winter or Fanon and many related writers, they don't say that we should now just abandon these deeply tainted notions of the human or humanity or equality. They don't say, these notions are so tainted by their origins that we should just throw them away. But what they do stress is that once we recognize the kind of inequalities and the exclusions that were contained within the very idea of human equality, we have to abandon the delusion that equality is just a matter of extending the scope, including more and more people under the banner of the human, including us regardless of our race, gender, religion, and so on. And in particular, we have to break with any vestiges of biologism, including the biologism implied in degrees of rationality. In Winter's version, we should come to see the human as, to quote her, a hybrid, auto-instituting, languaging, storytelling species. her work is really interesting. I've only recently discovered it, but for those of you who haven't come across this, she's really, really worth following up. I mean, I'm not myself entirely convinced by her alternative. I tend to the view that we should reject even improved and open definitions of the human as irrelevant to claims about equality, and I've argued this elsewhere in one of the books that Aniris mentioned, The Politics of the Human. But I do very much share this kind of analysis of the hierarchies and the exclusions that were built into the foundations of seemingly inclusive and egalitarian ideals. And I also share the view that this calls not for the abandonment of those ideals, but for their transformation. And I think actually this is one of the points that has been widely shared by feminists, anti-racists, and theorists of multiculturalism, that the pursuit of equality is not best understood as just extending the scope of the human, including more and more of the previously excluded within its remit. What you might describe as the, I too am human strategy. I think that formulation, when people say, look, I too am human, I mean, that's a very powerful strategy and can be extremely effective. But in a sense, it leaves untouched the original over-representation of particular kinds of human. I think we might infrequently employ that language as a way of exposing inconsistency and hypocrisy. But I think it's a mistake to represent the previous exclusions as just a failure of imagination. That's the kind of the happy story, the complacent story. There's a deeper problem here, and it argues against simpler strategies of extension and exclusion. But it doesn't at all render the language of human equality, or by extension, gender equality, meaningless. So that's the first kind of area, and it seems to me, to the extent that my perception that gender theorists talk less about gender equality than was the case in the past, I think part of it reflects that kind of skepticism about what you can do with the language of equality when it has such a sorry history, right? There's a second line of detachment, which also I think arises in engagement with global power hierarchies, but has been more focused on the substance of what we mean by gender equality. And I think this is something that's become an increasingly troubled issue in gender theory, where many now write about the difficulties of articulating universal ideals of equality or freedom without, in the process, smuggling in our own more parochial experiences and framework. If we believe that knowledge is in some sense situated, right, in some sense, framed by, affected by our own particular location, and it seems to me that most feminists incline to some version of this view that knowledge is situated, then we cannot but recognize that our own ideas of what constitutes equality are likely to reflect what we have experienced, read, or learned from those around us, rather than some straightforwardly universal truth. I mean, I say we cannot but of course very often we don't recognize this. It's not easy, and in fact, given the risks of political paralysis, perhaps not always desirable, but it's certainly not easy to sustain an attitude of continual doubt as regards your own most cherished beliefs. But if we don't recognize the ways in which we are simultaneously enabled and constrained by the context in which we find ourselves, which then affects our very capacity to think in certain ways, if we don't recognize that, we can become prey to assumptions of superiority over those who fall short of what we take to be the right way to live gender equality. Equality can then become a way to differentiate ourselves from those who appear to lack it. So we can scorn, for example, those women who are obsessively preoccupied with their physical beauty, or we can pity, from the other side, those who feel compelled to conceal their bodies from the male gaze in accordance with religious prescription. And we can congratulate ourselves on our superiority to these others who submit in multiple ways to patriarchal expectations. Now, if we do find ourselves thinking like this is clearly not a good position for a feminist to occupy. And yet sometimes the language of gender equality enables precisely that sense of superiority. Feminist theorist Serene Carter has been grappling with these issues for some time, recognizing on the one side the dangers of imposing a single conception of what gender equality means, ought to mean. But also she's very conscious that our worries about what you can broadly call cultural imperialism can lead to a kind of normative paralysis in which we feel unable to comment on other women's oppression. And I'm drawing here on some of the arguments she develops in a as yet unpublished book, though I think it will be in the bookstores by December, which is called Decolonizing Universalism, a Transnational Global Ethic, which I found very, very helpful in thinking through some of these issues. And in this, Carter argues that the norm uniting feminism is and should be the goal of ending sexist oppression, which she defines as, quote, systemic disadvantage that accrues to a person by virtue of membership or perceived membership in a gender or as a result of a system of gender. But in her argument, judging something as oppressive, as gender oppression, need not depend on some kind of preconceived notion of what it would mean to be equal, right? So, as she kind of points out, some feminists in the literature think that claiming your rights as an independent individual, right, unaffected by the influences of others, is a necessary component of gender equality. Though in the light of many criticisms in the literature about the notion of autonomy as a kind of self-sufficiency, that focus on equality as independence looks somewhat dubious. Other feminists have argued that equality requires the elimination of gender per se, as the feminist theorist Susan Moller-Okin once put this, quote, a just future would be one without gender. In its social structures and practices, one's sex would have no more relevance than one's eye colour or the length of one's toes. Others, again, consider any kind of adherence to tradition as intrinsically at odds with women's freedom. So they see the refusal of any kind of traditional dictates as a crucial first step towards gender equality. Now, Serene Carter takes issue with all of these and stresses their tendency to reinforce or install a kind of global hierarchy of those who think that they know and live better. Now, I think this aspect of her argument is relatively uncontroversial. We know that feminist endorsement of overly specific visions of a better life have sometimes become implicated with structures of neo-colonial power. And I think she makes a convincing case that when conditions are oppressive, simply calling on women to assert their independence or to refuse the support of their kinship systems can have devastating consequences for their well-being. There are transition costs, that is, in moving from one set of oppressive circumstances to another that might or might not be better, and you don't yet know, but there are certainly going to be some transition costs. But you could accept, these are all points about context sensitivity, and I think a lot of feminist theory today is very aware of the importance of thinking about context and alerting ourselves to the ways in which this shapes and possibly distorts our arguments. But you could accept these points without fundamentally changing your views about what, in the long run, constitutes gender equality. I think the more difficult question that she raises is whether it makes sense to think that we can identify oppression or inequality without drawing on some prior notion of what it is to be free and equal. And I think many philosophers, I address this to you, many philosophers would doubt the coherence of separating out the critical from the positive in this way. They would say, to the contrary, that the first task of the theorist is to identify what constitutes justice or what constitutes equality, and then to use this to identify cases of injustice or inequality. Or to put this in the language that became dominant in Anglo-American political theory, particularly since the work of John Rawls on the theory of justice, they believe that we must first work out the ideal theory, and then we can consider what to do in the non-ideal world. Now, Serene Carter is challenging this, and I think she's right to do so. It's not clear to me that we need to know what a just society looks like in order to identify something as injustice, or that we need to know what a state of perfect gender equality would look like in order to identify conditions of inequality. Now, I have to confess that for myself, I tend to the view that any division of labour based on gender is incompatible with gender equality. So a little bit like Susan Moller-Okin's notion that, a kind of a just world would be a world without gender. But I'm willing to recognise this as a preference or a speculation. I do not need to establish it as the only way to think about gender equality in order to be able to identify circumstances where women are oppressed, disadvantaged, and unequal. Talk of gender equality risks giving the impression that we already know what that condition looks like. And maybe we should be more restrained in our use of that language and talk more about gender inequality instead. The crucial thing is to refuse the inequalities, not that we all come to agree on what a state of equality looks like. There's a third and older worry about equality, and this is my third point, which I think has been long rehearsed in the feminist literature. And this is to the effect that the language of equality suggests women equalising themselves with men in a way that mistakenly equates equality with sameness and leaves men too much as the standard to which we should aspire. So in her book, Feminism and the Abyss of Freedom, for example, Linda Zarelli argues that feminists should shift their attention from equality and identity and focus more on action and freedom. And part of her reason for this is that, quote, the political principle of equality has tended to level all social and sexual differences and to force the assimilation of women to a masculine standard disguised as neutral and universal, not university. So, yes, indeed, but I think this is an argument that we've been having for many years. And I imagine that all today's gender theorists would agree in repudiating what the English feminist Eleanor Rathbone described nearly a century ago as a kind of Me Too feminism, yo tambien feminism, that simply claims for women an equal share of whatever rights and resources men had previously achieved for themselves. So men have the vote, women should have the vote, men have the right to work, women should have the right to work, men have the right to education, women should have the right to education. And she saw this, or she argued 100 years ago, that's a kind of Me Too feminism that is too limited in the way it defines itself. It patently leaves untouched all the important things that men didn't bother to campaign for, including new ways of organising the care work that is so central to women's experience and has been so poorly addressed by governments of virtually all political complexion. But it also leaves untouched the very conception of gender, because it seems to take for granted that there are two pre-constituted groups, the female sex and the male sex, or the feminine gender and the masculine gender, whose relative positions now need to be equalised. Yet if we think of gender equality in this way, it seems to me that we miss the key thing that we are challenging about the gender order. The key thing that we're challenging is those endless attempts to corral us into two distinct groups, to make us either male or female, masculine or feminine, and to define us through practices of gender. And I think the point here is not just that a language of equalising the genders makes it harder to address those who are transgender or who define themselves as gender fluid, though this is clearly a problem and certainly true. But I think the issue is a wider one, and it touches on everyone's need to get beyond the categorizations. And I think the point comes over clearly if you think of it in comparison with the way that we think about racial equality. I think as regards racial equality, it seems to me it's now very widely accepted that the category of race is itself a racist product, right? It's attaching various psychological, intellectual and emotional capacities to the nature of our skin colour or physiognomy, right? Now, if you accept that critique, if you accept the argument that the very category of race is part of the kind of the institution of racism, right? Then you can't think of racial equality as the pursuit of equality between race A and race B. Because framing it like that would mean that you were accepting without question that there are indeed these distinct races that need to be equalised. Now, you might say there's a slightly more biological basis for a distinction between male and female, but it seems to me that much the same point applies to gender equality. You can't think of gender equality as equality between gender A and gender B, because framing it like that accepts too much the reality of those gender distinctions. Now, I think this is a crucially important reminder. Though again, it doesn't mean we have to drop the language of equality. It just means, I think, that we have to be careful about the way in which we use it. And Zarrilli herself doesn't say we should stop talking about equality, but she does very strongly argue that we should shift the focus from equality to freedom. And in doing so, she draws inspiration from Hannah Arendt's conception of the political realm as the arena within which we can practice freedom and create the world anew. I have to say, thinking of politics as the arena in which we practice freedom and create the world anew is to me a rather extravagant understanding of the political and not easily recognisable in the actual practices of politics. But it's additionally troubling in the way it seems to minimise the importance of the social realm. This was always a criticism of Hannah Arendt's work, that she was famously distrustful of what she saw as the 20th century preoccupation with poverty, low income, inadequate housing, poor health. She saw this preoccupation as encouraging an overly instrumental view of politics and underplaying what she saw as the world-changing practice of politics. Now, Zarrilli distances herself from some of this indifference to the social, but broadly she shares Arendt's perspective. She wants what she calls a freedom-centred feminism, striving to bring about transformation in the normative conceptions of gender, and she encourages us to see feminism, quote, as a conflict-ridden, world-building practice of freedom. Now, I have no problem with the idea of feminism as action, nor with the notion that claiming rights is more transformative of who we are and how we see ourselves than simply being given them. But there's something rather ungrounded, I think, in this celebration of freedom and action as if they are ends in themselves. And I find I can't let go of my own preoccupation with women's greater economic vulnerability, greater vulnerability to violence, and lesser access to political influence and power. So as I hope is clear from what I've said so far, I do see much of importance in these reasons for worrying about the language of equality. But I remain myself very much a devotee of gender equality. And I take the message of all three concerns as calling for transformations in the ways we understand and deploy notions of equality and inequality, not as reasons for abandonment. And I want to end with a brief illustration as regards the issue of abortion, which is something that has been and continues to be a particularly important issue for feminists in Latin America. Now, one of the long-standing debates about reproductive rights has been whether we should frame the demand for safe and legal abortion in terms of a woman's right to choose, which is a sort of language very often used in the politics around reproductive rights? Should we frame it in terms of a woman's right to choose, or, as was the case in the United States, as protected a privacy right, a right not to be interfered with by the state in something that's a private matter, protected by the Constitution? Or should we see it in terms of our rights to do as we wish with our own bodies? Or should we see it as a matter of equality? There are problems potentially with all of these. When it's framed as a woman's right to choose, it seems to me it becomes vulnerable to the argument that it can legitimate female feticide. I mean, this is an argument that's made by a number of Indian feminists, including Nivedita Menon, who've pointed out that in highly patriarchal societies where giving birth to girl children can mark one as an inferior wife, putting one at risk of repudiation or even death, women may well choose selective termination of girl fetuses in order to ensure they give birth only to boys. Now, we could say, oh, well, this isn't women choosing, right? But it's women choosing under conditions that come very close to coercion, and you could sort of argue that. But I think even so, the example throws up worries about framing reproductive rights only in the language of a woman's right to choose. And I think it reminds us of that point that I made earlier, that many of the ways we define political goals may be overly shaped by our own specific experience. Framing abortion as a privacy right worked successfully for many decades in the United States, though is now, of course, very much threatened there. But has also been criticised, most notably by Catherine McKinnon. As McKinnon stresses, feminists do not, on the whole, want to shelter behind privacy rights when it comes to other issues. You know, we don't want violence within the home to be treated as a private matter. We don't want sexual harassment to be regarded as a private matter of interpersonal relations. We want to challenge much of what is assumed about the public-private divide. I also myself think it problematic to frame abortion as a property right, which is the third way that you might think of it, because this encourages us to think of our bodies as property, this is my body to do what I like with, and to think of property as something over which we can assert control. And I don't have time to expand on this, but in a recent book on our bodies whose property, I take issue with the use of that property metaphor to conceptualize our relationships with our bodies, and argue that the implied mind-body dualism fails to recognize the sense in which we are our bodies. I also take issue with the idea that if something is property, then this means we can do, no one else can tell us what to do with it. You know, if you thought that, then you'd be refusing the rights of governments to impose taxes, set rent controls, or insist on planning permission, or all sorts of ways in which governments do and should continue to regulate private property. So each of these arguments for reproductive rights has its weaknesses. And for me, it's impossible to capture why we need the right to free and legal abortion without appealing to the notion of equality. It seems to me that at its heart is the fact that it is women, and only women, who get pregnant, that treating abortion as a criminal act subjects women, but only women, to unwanted pregnancies, leads women, but only women, to die in illicit backstreet abortions. And given the continuing gender division of labour as regards the way we care for our children, it means that women, and mainly women, will be the ones who have to find a way to feed and clothe and care for children in conditions where they knew in advance it would be almost impossible. So refusing women any right, any access to abortion, co-opts women's bodies, but only women's bodies, to sustain the life of the fetus. It seems to me that there's a pressing issue of equality here, but it's also a good case where it needs to be equality transformed. I mean, if you just left it like that, it would seem too much like a case of that kind of Me Too feminism that I mentioned before. You know, an argument like, you might be saying, well, you know, nobody requires men to give over their bodies for 9 months, you know, so nobody should require this of women either, right? You know, you could frame it in that way. You could say, you know, nobody expects this of men, so, you know, women should have the right not to do this. Now, putting it like that hardly addresses the complexities and the potential anguish of abortion. But also, since pregnancy can never be shared equally between women and men, framing the demand in these somewhat arithmetic terms seems to miss the point. And I think I prefer to see the issue as offering a further illustration of what the kind of argument that Serene Carter is developing. We can see that denying access to free and legal abortion oppresses women and treats them as beings of lesser importance. But we can see that without necessarily knowing what in this context it would mean to treat women and men equally, right? You can sort of separate out these two things. So this is my main point, and it's not, I think, an entirely novel one. None of the points we make ever are. Neither equality nor inequality is a simple notion. And I think equality in particular comes to us weighed down with very considerable historical baggage. With all this in mind, I am sometimes frustrated by the mission statements that are adopted in national and international documents when it seems to me they fail to acknowledge the complexity or represent the goal of gender equality as more straightforward than it is. I think we need to reclaim equality from some overly bland statements of it and accept the challenge of complexity. But we need to do this in order to put ways of thinking about gender equality back at the heart of gender theory. Thank you.